A teenage boy boards first class, quiet, respectful, and black. Minutes later, a flight attendant slaps his hand, accuses him of lying, and forces him to the back of the plane. What she didn't know? He's the son of a billionaire. And with just one text, he stops the entire aircraft from taking off. What happened next forced an airline and every passenger to face the truth at 36,000 feet. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. He walked through Gate 17 of JFK International Airport without a sound. His footsteps hushed against the sterile tile floor, hoodie drawn, face half hidden in the shadow of his cap. No entourage, no flash. Just a 17-year-old boy traveling alone. To most of the world, he looked like a quiet teen who might have been lucky to fly standby. A kid with long limbs and sharp eyes, polite but invisible. No one noticed when he passed the gold-plated first-class sign. No one questioned when he stepped onto the jet bridge. Not yet. Jalen knew this routine well. He didn't flaunt his name, not in public, especially not here, especially not now. He preferred stillness, silence, the kind of calm that came from being underestimated. That's when people told on themselves. That's when you learned the truth. Inside the aircraft, the smell of citrus cleaner and recycled air clung to every surface. A flight attendant in her early 40s stood near the entrance, greeting each passenger with the same mechanical smile. But when her eyes met his, something shifted. Her name badge read, Deborah. Her smile paused mid-formation. She tilted her head, assessing. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. A boy, a hoodie, alone. First class? Jalen offered a soft nod and walked past her without waiting for permission. Seat 1C. Aisle. He liked the aisle. Easier to see everything. He stowed his backpack in the overhead bin, careful not to disturb anyone, then sat with quiet precision. No one looked twice. The man across from him adjusted his watch. The woman to his left clutched a designer purse and glanced at her phone. He opened a book, but he felt it before it arrived. The shift, the pause, the sound of steps returning. "Excuse me," Deborah said, voice just loud enough to claim territory. "I need to check your boarding pass." Jalen looked up, startled, but not confused. "It's right here," he said, offering the digital pass on his phone screen. She didn't look at the screen. Not really. She looked at him. Then again, at the pass. Then at him once more, like the math didn't add up. "This is for first class," she said flatly. "Yes," Jalen replied, calm as breath. Deborah crossed her arms. "And you're flying alone?" "Yes." Her tone shifted, sharper now. "Who bought your ticket?" Jalen blinked, still seated. "Does it matter?" There was a pause, a long one. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing something off. Deborah didn't flinch. She stepped closer, violating the quiet zone of civility that passengers expected. "I need to verify with the gate. This seems irregular." Jalen didn't move. "You're welcome to verify. I'll wait." But Deborah didn't go to the gate. She didn't call a supervisor. She stayed there, as if the seat itself was somehow in danger by his presence. And then she did something no one expected. She reached across him, snatched the phone from his hand, and in the motion, slapped the side of his fingers. The sound, a loud stinging pop, cracked through the cabin. A few people gasped. The man in 1A looked up from his newspaper. The woman with the designer bag stared. But still, no one said a word. Jalen recoiled, not in pain, but disbelief. That wasn't necessary, he said quietly. You need to come with me, Deborah snapped. He stood slowly, collected his backpack, and walked the walk he'd seen too many others take. The long, humiliating aisle through whispers and averted eyes. No one stopped her. No one stopped him. Even those who knew something was wrong said nothing. Because they didn't want to get involved. Because maybe they thought she was right. Because maybe they told themselves it was a misunderstanding. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He just took an empty seat in the last row, shoved between two strangers, the engine hum his only companion. Then he reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, the one she hadn't managed to keep, and typed one line of text. She slapped my hand. I'm in the back. He hit send. Somewhere, miles above the city skyline in a mirrored tower in Chicago, a different kind of storm began to gather. The message was read almost instantly, and the man reading it didn't hesitate. His name was Elijah Monroe, founder of 5 global tech companies, a quiet, deliberate billionaire whose fingerprints were woven into the digital infrastructure of half the country. He was also Jalen's father. And in this moment, he became something more. He became still. Then he made one call, and the plane stopped moving. The flight that was moments from taxiing froze on the tarmac. The crew was instructed to delay departure. A code was entered into the gate system, triggering a cascade of alerts. Inside the cockpit, the captain received a message he hadn't seen in 15 years of flying. Hold at gate. Executive override. Do not depart. The captain, puzzled, looked over at his co-pilot. Executive override? Yeah, the co-pilot replied, eyes wide. From corporate. Something serious. And it was. Back in the last row, Jalen closed his eyes, letting the sound of the engines fade into background. He didn't smile. He didn't fume. He waited. He knew his father wouldn't let this sit. Up front, Deborah stood near the galley, confused by the sudden halt in activity. A younger attendant approached. We just got word we're being held, she whispered. Deborah frowned. Why? Weather's clear. The attendant shrugged. Don't know. Something from the top. You might want to talk to the captain. And for the first time that morning, Deborah felt a tremor ripple down her spine, a tightening in her chest, a realization, slow, sharp, and irreversible. She hadn't just kicked a boy out of a seat. She had humiliated the wrong person, and the seatbelt sign hadn't even turned off yet. The silence in the last row of the aircraft was thick, but it was nothing compared to the quiet storm that raged behind Jalen's composed exterior. The low thrum of the engines had become background noise, a kind of emotional static that echoed the distance he now felt, not just from his seat in first class, but from the dignity stripped from him without a word of protest from anyone around. Jalen had never needed a crowd. He didn't need affirmation. He had been raised to lead with presence, not noise. But this wasn't about ego. This was about a moment that kept repeating itself in his mind. The slap, the stare, the command to move. It hadn't been physical pain that stayed with him. It was the disbelief, the certainty in Deborah's voice, the entitlement in her eyes, the absolute conviction that he didn't belong. She didn't ask. She decided. And now, as the plane sat motionless, suspended between protocol and consequence, Jalen felt every second tick by like a reckoning taking shape. In the cockpit, the captain had received the second update. It was short and direct. Executive contact, Elijah Monroe. Full authority granted. Immediate compliance expected. The captain didn't ask questions. He had flown planes for nearly 2 decades, but he knew when to recognize gravity, and not just the kind that pulled metal birds from the sky. He turned to his co-pilot and muttered, "That boy in 1C? We moved him?" The co-pilot nodded. "Apparently, he's the reason we're grounded." In the cabin, whispers began to bubble beneath the polished surface of luxury travel. A woman in pearls leaned over to her husband and murmured, "I heard she slapped him." That's what delayed the flight. The husband, a man with thinning gray hair and a pressed blazer, shook his head slowly. Unbelievable. Back in the galley, Deborah felt her certainty beginning to crack. Her hands were folded, but her knuckles had turned white. She had operated on instinct, years of subtle cues, silent judgments, glances she never second-guessed. It was never direct, never loud. That was the danger of it. It dressed itself in procedure and called itself experience. But she knew now, deep in her gut, that something had shifted. Something she couldn't smooth over with an apology and a napkin. And she hadn't even asked his name. Back in 39F, Jalen's phone vibrated. A message from his father. "They know now. Stay seated. Don't speak. Don't move unless asked. Let the silence teach them." He read it twice. Elijah Monroe didn't speak often, but when he did, it was precise. Power, Jalen had learned, was not in volume, but in patience. In the ability to make others listen without needing to shout. In seat 3A, a man tapped nervously on his armrest. He had watched the boy get moved. He'd seen the flight attendant's tone, her posture, the way she hadn't checked anyone else's boarding pass. He had said nothing. And now that silence was burning in his throat. When he turned back to look down the aisle, the boy wasn't looking at anyone. Just forward. Still. Like someone used to waiting for the world to catch up. Suddenly, the intercom pinged. "Ms. Deborah Lanning, please report to the cockpit." The voice was calm. Too calm. Deborah flinched. The younger flight attendant beside her glanced over. "You okay?" Deborah nodded too fast, then stepped forward, trying to mask the fear clawing its way up her spine. As she approached the front, she noticed the man in 1A lower his newspaper. His gaze followed her. The cockpit door opened before she knocked. The captain's expression was unreadable. "Close the door," he said. The moment it clicked shut, he spoke again. "We've been contacted by Mr. Elijah Monroe's office. That boy, Jalen, is his son." Deborah's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "You didn't follow boarding verification protocol. You made assumptions. You touched him. And now, we're grounded." She tried to explain. "It wasn't meant—" "It doesn't matter what you meant," the captain interrupted, voice cold. "It matters what you did. Mr. Monroe has requested that you apologize. In front of the cabin. Publicly. Or you will be escorted off this flight immediately." Her breath caught. "In front of the passengers?" "Yes," the captain said. "All of them." Back in row 39F, Jalen didn't move. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his father. "She's about to walk that aisle. Watch her, but don't say a word." He slid the phone into his pocket and exhaled. The sound of slow footsteps echoed in the cabin as Deborah returned. passengers turned their heads. The atmosphere shifted like a sudden draft through still air. She walked slowly, her composure cracked like porcelain. When she reached the final row, she stopped, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice quieter than before. "I want to apologize. I misjudged you, and I acted inappropriately. I hope you'll accept my sincere apology." Jalen didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't rise. Instead, he simply looked at her with a calm so rooted it made her knees feel unsteady. "I accept your apology," he said after a moment. "But you didn't just misjudge me. You made a decision about who belonged and who didn't." She swallowed hard. "I hope," he continued, "you think about who else you've done that to. Who didn't have someone powerful to call, who had to sit in silence. The words weren't cruel. They were measured, and they landed like weight on her shoulders." Deborah nodded once and turned to leave, her figure small now beneath the scrutiny of those once too silent to speak. As she walked past the front rows, a few passengers lowered their eyes. Some watched with approval. One even gave a slow, solemn nod. Back in his seat, Jalen rested his head against the window. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. This was about exposure. And exposure, when earned, doesn't require volume. It only requires that the world stops pretending not to see. At 36,000 feet, where the clouds looked soft, but the truths felt sharp, the cabin of Flight 421 had settled into a disquieting stillness. Drinks were being served, seat belts remained fastened, and the hum of the engines blended with the quiet rustle of pages turning and screens flickering. But beneath it all was the altitude of consequence, where the air was thin and accountability traveled faster than sound. Jalen sat in 39 degrees Fahrenheit, still as ever, his profile cast in the dim light filtering from the overhead. He hadn't moved since Deborah's apology. He had barely spoken. But his silence wasn't avoidance. It was presence. A kind of unshakable steadiness that unnerved those who had watched the earlier confrontation unfold, but said nothing. There's something unsettling about watching a person you dismissed suddenly command a room with nothing but silence. That's what Jalen had become, a mirror they couldn't look away from. 3 rows ahead, a woman who had once looked at him with suspicion now glanced back with something else. Guilt, maybe, or self-awareness. She hadn't joined the murmur of defense or dissent. She hadn't offered an apology either. She had simply watched. And watching, as it turned out, was no longer passive. Back in the galley, Deborah stood pressed against the wall near the coffee station, her hands clasped tightly, the shake in her fingers betraying the tight-lipped composure she fought to maintain. The paper she'd signed, the preliminary removal order, felt heavier than it looked. Taylor, quiet and observant, stood nearby, offering neither comfort nor condemnation. "You okay?" she asked gently, though she already knew the answer. Deborah didn't reply at first. Then she said, "I've flown this route for 12 years, and I don't think I've ever felt this small." Taylor didn't respond. Some things weren't meant to be fixed with words. Not anymore. In the cockpit, the captain received the latest communication from corporate. The official inquiry had been initiated. Statements would be gathered upon landing. The CEO himself had requested an internal review of boarding procedures and in-flight conduct. "This is a turning point," the message read. And it was. Because high above the earth, the truth was beginning to descend with gravity. The passengers could feel it, the weight of being witnesses, the discomfort of their silence now echoing louder than any engine. Jalen wasn't looking for anyone to speak. He had stopped expecting it a long time ago. But something was shifting. The eyes that once scanned him with suspicion now lingered longer, unsure how to meet his gaze, uncertain what they would find if they did. He took a slow breath, watching the condensation of his glass of water. That glass, filled politely by Taylor earlier, had been more than refreshment. It had been a gesture of restoration. One small action trying to balance a scale too often left tilted. Across the aisle, a man in a navy suit leaned toward him. His voice was low, tentative. "I didn't say anything earlier. I should have. I'm sorry." Jalen looked at him calmly. "Why didn't you?" The man exhaled. "Because I didn't think it would make a difference. And that's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I didn't want to make it worse." "It was already worse," Jalen replied. "Silence doesn't make things safer. It just makes the damage quieter." The man sat back slowly, absorbing the words. No defensiveness, just reckoning. Farther back, two younger passengers shared a phone screen, watching a video silently uploaded by a traveler in the middle cabin. It showed the moment Deborah had approached Jalen. Her voice, her tone, her posture. It was all there. The slap wasn't caught on camera, but the humiliation was unmistakable. The video had already been viewed 12,000 times in under an hour. And climbing. Meanwhile, Jalen's father, Elijah Monroe, was on a call with the airline's board of directors. He wasn't threatening legal action. Not yet. He wasn't interested in making headlines or demanding firings. He wanted change. He wanted systemic acknowledgement that what had happened to his son wasn't isolated. "This isn't about one attendant," he said calmly. "It's about a pattern. And you don't get to fix this with PR. You fix it by unlearning what you thought professionalism looked like." Back on the plane, Jalen shifted in his seat for the first time in nearly an hour. He opened his phone, not to scroll, but to read the latest message from his father. "They're listening. Keep your head up." He typed one line in return. "I don't want them to be afraid. I want them to be aware." At that same moment, Taylor re-entered the cabin with a tray of drinks. Her steps were steady, but her heart wasn't. She passed Jalen, paused briefly, and leaned down. "They're starting to understand," she said softly. Jalen nodded. "Some will. The rest?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Awareness doesn't reach everyone at once. But once it starts, it spreads. Quietly. Powerfully. Like cabin pressure, shifting slowly until you can't ignore the change in your breathing. As the aircraft soared above the clouds, something else was rising too. Consequence. Not just for Deborah, but for every passenger who sat in that first-class cabin and witnessed a boy be stripped of dignity, only to realize too late that they were sitting on the wrong side of history. And history, like altitude, has a way of revealing who you are when the air gets thin. The wheels touched down on the tarmac with a soft jolt, but for Jalen Monroe, it didn't feel like arrival. It felt like exposure. As the aircraft slowed to a crawl, he looked out the window at the city skyline beyond, familiar and indifferent. The landing gear had done its job, but inside the cabin, the air still felt thinner than it should. The kind of air you breathe when you know all eyes are about to turn your way, and none of them quite know what to say. Flight 421 had become more than a journey. It had become a memory none of them would leave behind. not because of turbulence or a missed connection, but because of a moment that had peeled back the illusion of comfort, revealing something raw and unsettling beneath it. Jalen sat quietly in seat 39F, watching the terminal lights blur through the window. He wasn't thinking about headlines or consequences. He was thinking about how silence felt heavier than confrontation, about how even when things are handled, something inside you still hurts where the bruise doesn't show. The captain's voice broke through the quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International. We ask that you remain seated as ground crew prepares the aircraft for arrival. There will be a brief delay before deboarding. We appreciate your patience. But patience wasn't what filled the cabin. It was tension, awareness, the kind that lingers in rooms where injustice has unfolded and no one quite knows how to move forward without stepping on the shame left behind. In the galley, Deborah stood stiffly, arms crossed, eyes on the exit. Her uniform felt too tight now, her badge heavier than before. She had said her apology. She had walked him back. But none of that had undone what came before. And worse, she knew it wouldn't. Taylor approached her with a folded paper from the captain, a final directive from corporate. You are to remain on board until escorted by airline management. Please surrender your crew badge before leaving the aircraft. Deborah read the sentence once, then twice, as if disbelief could delay the reality. She didn't speak. She just unpinned the metal badge and dropped it into Taylor's open hand. The weight of it landed with a soft clink, but its sound echoed through her. I didn't mean, she began, but Taylor cut her off with a look. Not cruel, not angry, just done. You didn't have to mean it, Taylor said. You just had to stop it before it happened. Deborah looked away, her eyes unfocused. She wasn't thinking about protocol anymore. She was remembering Jalen's face when she slapped his hand. How composed he'd been. How much smaller she'd felt the moment she realized who he was. Not just a black teenage boy in a hoodie, but someone with power. But now she saw what she hadn't before. Even if he hadn't had that last name, that connection, that reach, it still would have been wrong. And that's what haunted her most. In the cabin, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, slowly, as if unsure how to end a journey that had changed in the middle. Passengers fidgeted, checked their phones, cast glances toward the back where Jalen remained still, unbothered on the surface, but etched with something deeper beneath. A woman in row 37 leaned toward her husband. You think the airline will make a statement? I hope they do, he whispered back, but I think he already made the louder one. Jalen didn't respond to the quiet murmur around him. He felt it all, but let none of it move him. He was waiting, not for an apology, not for validation, but for something else. Something that might never arrive. Understanding. The door to the aircraft finally opened with a soft hiss, and a uniformed gate supervisor stepped inside. Behind him stood a man in a navy blazer and a woman holding a clipboard, her expression unreadable. They didn't walk directly to first class as they usually did. Instead, they paused, glanced toward the back of the plane, and waited. Passenger Monroe, the supervisor said. You're invited to disembark last, per request of corporate. Jalen stood slowly, nodded once, and grabbed his backpack. As he moved through the aisle, every passenger who had once stared in silence now made space, not just with their legs, but with their eyes. They saw him now, not as the boy in row 39F, but as the person who shifted something in them. however uncomfortably. One by one, as he passed, heads turned. A few mouths opened, unsure of the words. One man whispered, "Thank you." A woman touched her chest lightly. Another offered a small nod. Not validation, not pity, just acknowledgement. That was all he'd ever wanted. At the front of the aircraft, the airline rep stepped forward, voice quiet. "We're deeply sorry, Mr. Monroe. Our CEO would like to meet with you if you're open to it. We're committed to doing better." Jalen paused before answering. "Then don't start with a meeting. Start with the people you hire. Train them to see passengers, not problems." The man nodded slowly, words failing him. As Jalen stepped off the plane, the morning light outside met him like a reckoning. The world hadn't changed while he was in the air, but something inside him had. And maybe, just maybe, something inside those who watched had changed too. Deborah sat alone in the rear jump seat, waiting. The cabin empty now, the silence no longer comforting, just echoing. And for the first time in her career, the ground didn't feel safe, because now, for the first time, it was asking her to answer for something she couldn't outrun. Not a delay, not a protocol error, but a choice. And choices, once exposed, leave footprints that never fade. Jalen walked through the terminal like he had done so many times before. But today, the floor beneath him felt different. Not just harder or colder, but real in a way that demanded presence. The crowd moved around him, unaware of what had happened just moments earlier inside that plane. Yet behind him trailed an invisible thread, woven with glances, whispers, and a silence that had spoken louder than any announcement over the intercom. Waiting at the gate was a sleek black SUV, flanked by two figures in tailored suits, their faces marked with a politeness that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with control. One of them stepped forward and introduced himself as Andrew Holt, Senior Executive Liaison for the airline. His voice was even, respectful, but it couldn't mask the weight of corporate discomfort. "We'd like to offer a formal apology, Mr. Monroe," he began, "and open the door for any further dialogue you'd be willing to have with our leadership team." Jalen paused, his hands still resting on the strap of his bag. "Dialogue isn't what matters right now," he said calmly. "Change does." They exchanged glances, but nodded. Words were easy. What came next wouldn't be. He stepped into the car without looking back. The leather interior was cool against his skin, but it didn't ease the restlessness inside him. He thought about the woman who had struck his hand, about the passengers who had watched, about the people who would see the video and feel something: rage, shame, maybe reflection. But he also thought about Taylor. She hadn't spoken at first, but when she finally did, it hadn't been scripted. It had been human. And sometimes, one honest voice mattered more than a room full of polite ones. As the car pulled away from the curb, his phone buzzed with another message from his father. "Media inquiries are surging. We'll control the narrative. You did what needed to be done." Jalen didn't reply immediately. He stared out the window as the city blurred past, 1,000 strangers going about their day, unaware they had just inherited a story that would stretch beyond the flight, beyond the gate, and into something larger. Not every moment demands a revolution. Sometimes it only takes a refusal to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be silenced. At headquarters later that week, the airline released a statement, not filled with vague regrets or empty platitudes, but with clear directives. Mandatory anti-bias training, new boarding protocols, a public apology addressed not just to Jalen, but to every passenger who has ever been seen as less than. It didn't fix everything. It couldn't. But it started something. And Jalen? He didn't go on camera. He didn't give interviews. But he did meet with youth organizations across the country, sharing not his name, but his experience, teaching others how to stand without shouting, how to let dignity carry the weight that anger sometimes cannot. The flight was over, but the impact had only just begun. Because what landed that day wasn't just a plane, it was a truth. And truth, once seen, never goes back to sleep. Jalen Monroe never set out to make a statement. He boarded that plane like any other passenger, quiet, respectful, just trying to get from one place to another. He didn't expect the judgment. He didn't expect the slap. And he certainly didn't expect to become the center of a lesson the entire cabin, and soon the entire country, would be forced to witness. What happened in Seat 1C wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It was something more insidious, a reflection of a truth many people experience every day, but rarely have the platform to challenge. Jalen was judged, not for what he said, not for what he did, but for how he looked. For daring to exist in a space where someone like him wasn't expected. But unlike so many who faced that moment alone, Jalen had something else. Not just privilege, not just access, but a voice backed by clarity, and a father who knew how to turn power into accountability. And in that moment, when Jalen refused to cause a scene and instead sent a single message, he shifted the entire dynamic. The slap that was meant to shame him only amplified the injustice, because this time, someone was watching. And this time, silence didn't win. The flight was delayed. The story unraveled. The truth spread faster than turbulence. Passengers who had sat in stunned silence began to reflect. Flight attendants, who once followed protocol, started to question the system. And an airline that had brushed aside countless smaller indignities was now forced to listen. Because the voice they ignored came backed by someone they couldn't. But the real power in this story wasn't Jalen's wealth. It wasn't his family name. It was the way he held his dignity when others tried to strip it away. The way he sat back down in the same seat he was kicked out of. Not with vengeance, but with quiet purpose. And how he reminded every witness on that plane that justice doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes, it just needs to stand its ground. From the first cold glance to the final apology, this wasn't just a personal moment. It was a public reckoning. And the question it leaves us with is this: how often do we watch something wrong and say nothing? How often do we justify our silence, hoping someone else will speak up? The lesson here is not just about race. It's about recognition. It's about remembering that presence matters, and dignity should never come second to prejudice. That when someone is forced to the back, literally or metaphorically, it's our responsibility to notice, to speak, to shift the story. So how can we apply this in our lives? It starts small. Look closer. Don't assume. When you see someone treated unfairly, don't look away. You don't need power to make a difference. You just need the courage to see. Let Jalen's story be a reminder that silence can be broken, that even the quietest resistance can roar, that dignity doesn't need to scream to demand respect. It only needs to stand. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you pause even for a moment, please take a second to support this channel. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and drop a comment below, sharing where you're watching from. Every like, every share helps us bring more stories like this to life. Stories that matter, stories that inspire, and stories that remind us all of what it means to be human. Thanks for being here. Stay awake, stay kind, and remember, some flights change more than destinations. They change us.